They gave me the smallest room at my husband's funeral, and they did it without hesitation, as if my place had already been decided long before I ever arrived. I stood in the hotel lobby with my coat folded neatly over my arm, watching as guests were greeted with warm smiles and guided towards spacious suites with wide windows and soft lighting, while I was handed a key card with a brief nod and no explanation, and I took it without question, because I have learned that the truth reveals itself much faster when you do not interrupt it. And I walked down the corridor slowly, the carpet soft beneath my steps, the walls lined with framed photographs of a place I knew in a way no one else in that building could understand. And when I reached the final door at the end of the hall, I paused for just a moment before opening it, and inside was exactly what I expected. A narrow room, modest, contained, carefully arranged to appear sufficient, but never intended to feel significant. And I stepped inside, setting my suitcase beside the bed, taking in every detail without reaction, because reaction would have given meaning to something that did not deserve it. And I closed the door behind me gently, the sound quiet but final, and I stood there for a moment, not disappointed, not surprised, simply aware. Because this was not an accident, it was a message, and messages like this are rarely delivered by strangers, and I could still hear her voice from earlier in the lobby. Lydia moving through the space with confidence, speaking to staff, directing arrangements, assigning rooms as if she had always belonged at the center of everything. And I had watched her carefully, the way she carried herself, the way she filled the room with certainty, the way people responded to that certainty without question, and I understood that she believed she was in control, that she believed authority could be claimed simply by stepping into it. And I said nothing then, just as I said nothing now, because silence, when chosen, is not submission, it is position. And I removed my coat slowly, placing it over the chair with deliberate care, smoothing the fabric as if the gesture itself mattered more than the space I had been given. And I walked toward the small window, looking out at the side of the building where no one else had been placed, the view quiet, removed, almost invisible, and I allowed myself a single breath, not of frustration, but of recognition, because this was never about comfort, it was about hierarchy, about showing me exactly where they believed I belonged, and I accepted it without resistance, not because I agreed, but because I understood something they did not. Something that made this room, this hallway, and this entire building far less important than they imagined. And I turned back into the room, my posture steady, my expression unchanged, because there are moments when being overlooked is not a loss, it is an advantage. And as I sat down on the edge of the bed, I realized that they had not just given me the smallest room in the hotel, they had given me the clearest view of what they were about to lose. I did not rush to leave the room, because there was nothing outside of it that required my urgency. And I have learned that when people expect you to react, choosing not to becomes its own kind of clarity. And I sat there for a moment longer, listening to the distant sounds of movement beyond the walls, the soft roll of luggage across the carpet, the quiet murmur of voices preparing for something they believed they understood. And then I stood, smoothing my dress with the same measured care I had carried all day, not out of habit, but because every detail matters when everything else is being misjudged. And I stepped into the hallway again, the door closing softly behind me, and I walked toward the main corridor, where the atmosphere shifted almost immediately. Brighter, more open, the kind of space designed to welcome those considered important. And I moved through it without hesitation, not seeking attention, not avoiding it, simply present. And as I approached the main lounge, I saw Lydia exactly where she expected to be, positioned at the center of the room, speaking with confidence to a group of guests, her posture controlled, her tone steady, her gestures deliberate as she directed staff and assigned rooms as if every decision flowed naturally from her. And I watched her for a moment, not with resentment, not with surprise, but with understanding, because people reveal their assumptions most clearly when they believe no one is challenging them, and Daniel stood just behind her, quiet, agreeable, his presence supporting hers without question, and I could see in his expression that he had already accepted the version of events being presented to him, not because he had confirmed it, but because it was easier than asking. And I stepped forward then, passing just close enough for Lydia to notice me, and she did, her expression shifting briefly into something controlled and polite, the kind of acknowledgement that suggests inclusion while reinforcing distance. And she told me everything had been taken care of, that I should not worry about the arrangements, that I could simply rest, and I looked at her calmly, meeting her eyes without hesitation, and I told her I was not worried, and she smiled as if that answer confirmed her understanding, as if my calm meant agreement, and she turned back to her conversation without pause, continuing to move through the room as if nothing needed to change, and I continued walking, noticing the way a few staff members glanced at me differently, not openly, not in a way that would draw attention, but in a quiet recognition that did not align with how Lydia had positioned me, and I did not acknowledge it, because recognition does not require response to exist, and I made my way toward the far end of the lobby where the large windows overlooked the entrance. And I stood there for a moment, watching as more guests arrived, as Lydia continued to direct the flow of everything around her, as the structure she believed she controlled appeared to respond to her every move. And I understood that she believed this was already settled, that she believed the roles had been assigned and accepted, and I let that belief remain exactly where it was, because there are moments when allowing someone to continue is the only way they will fully understand what they have overlooked. And as I turned away from the window and began walking back toward my room, I knew that everything she believed she had secured was already beginning to shift beneath her. She just had not felt it yet. When I stepped back into the room, the quiet greeted me the same way it had before, unchanged, unaffected by everything unfolding beyond its walls. And I closed the door gently behind me, allowing the silence to settle once more, because there is a difference between being excluded and choosing distance. And I had already made that distinction clear for myself, and I moved toward the small desk again, placing my hand lightly against its surface, grounding myself not in the space I had been given, but in the awareness of why it had been given at all. And I sat down slowly, my posture steady, my expression calm, because clarity does not come from reaction, it comes from understanding. And I reached for my phone, unlocking it without urgency, scrolling through messages that had already been addressed, until I stopped at one that had arrived earlier, a brief confirmation, precise, expected, and I opened it again, reading each line carefully, not because I needed to understand it, but because I recognized the timing, the structure, the quiet assurance behind it, and it confirmed exactly what I had known all along, that everything beneath the surface remained exactly where it had always been, that nothing had shifted despite what had been assumed above it. And I set the phone down again, my hands resting lightly on the desk, because confirmation does not require celebration, it only requires acknowledgement. And I stood, moving toward the mirror, looking at my reflection for a moment, not searching for reassurance, but recognizing the steadiness that had carried me through every decision long before this day had arrived. And I adjusted my sleeve slightly, smoothing the fabric with the same deliberate care I had shown since the moment I walked into this hotel, because small actions reveal more than words ever could. And I thought of Richard briefly, not with sorrow, not in a way that pulled me backward, but with clarity, remembering the quiet conversations we had shared, the decisions made without urgency, without the need for anyone else to understand them. And I realized again that nothing about this moment had caught me unprepared. Not Lydia's confidence, not the way she had taken control, not even the room I had been given. Because preparation does not always look like action. Sometimes it looks like patience. And I turned away from the mirror, walking back toward the window, small as it was, looking out at the side of the building where the lights had begun to settle into the evening, and I could still hear faint movement beyond the walls. Lydia continuing to manage everything, as if control could be maintained simply by holding on to it tightly enough. And I allowed that to continue because there's a difference between control and ownership. And that difference does not need to be explained. It only needs to be revealed. And I stepped back from the window, my posture unchanged, my expression steady, because what had already been established did not require my defense. It only required time. And as I looked around that small room once more, I understood that it was never about where they placed me. It was about what they believed that placement meant. And that belief, like everything built on assumption, was already beginning to shift whether they realized it or not. By the time I stepped out again, the atmosphere had shifted into something more deliberate. The kind of quiet organization that signals an event is about to begin. And I moved through the hallway with the same steady pace, not rushing, not hesitating, simply present, because presence has a way of revealing what performance tries to conceal. And as I approached the main room, I could see that everything had been arranged with precision. Rows of chairs aligned, flowers placed carefully, lighting softened just enough to create a sense of solemn importance. And Lydia stood at the center of it all once again, speaking with the coordinator, her tone controlled, her posture firm, her movements efficient as she adjusted details that she believed required her direction. And I watched her for a moment before stepping further into the space, not to interrupt, not to challenge, but to observe how far her certainty extended. And Daniel stood nearby, quieter than before, his attention shifting more frequently, as if something beneath the surface had begun to feel uncertain, even if he could not yet define it. And Lydia noticed me as I moved along the edge of the room, her expression tightening for just a fraction of a second before smoothing into something composed, and she turned slightly toward me, offering a brief acknowledgement, telling me that everything was ready, that I did not need to concern myself with anything, that I could simply take my place when the time came. And I met her gaze calmly, not agreeing, not disagreeing, simply present. And I told her that everything looked exactly as she intended, and that was enough for her, because she heard confirmation where there was only observation, and she turned back to the coordinator without hesitation, continuing her instructions with the same confidence she had carried all day. And I moved further into the room, positioning myself where I could see both the arrangement and the people within it, because structure often reveals more than conversation ever will. And as staff members moved through the space, I noticed again the subtle difference in how they responded when I was near. A slight pause, a quiet acknowledgement, something unspoken that did not align with Lydia's assumed authority. And I allowed it to remain unaddressed, because truth does not require immediate recognition to exist. And I stood there as guests began to take their seats, as the room settled into a quiet expectation, as Lydia remained at the center of everything she believed she controlled. And yet beneath it all, there was a shift, something quiet, something steady, something that had nothing to do with her instructions or her presence. And I recognized it immediately because it had been there long before today, long before this arrangement, long before any of them had decided where I belonged. And I remained still, my posture unchanged, my expression calm, because moments like this are not about action, they are about timing, and timing has a way of revealing what people believe they have secured. And as the final preparations came to a close and the room fell into a deeper silence, I understood that everything Lydia had built in appearance was about to meet something far more permanent, something she had never considered. And I allowed that moment to approach without interference, because what is real does not need to be announced. It simply arrives when it is ready. The room settled into silence as the final guests took their seats, the kind of silence that carries expectation rather than comfort. And I remained where I was, positioned just far enough from the center to observe everything without becoming part of it, because observation has always revealed more to me than participation ever could. And Lydia stood at the front now, her posture composed, her expression carefully arranged to reflect control and composure. And as she spoke quietly with the coordinator one last time, I could see the certainty in her movements, the way she believed everything had been placed exactly as intended. And Daniel sat among the guests, his gaze shifting more often now, not restless, but uncertain, as if something beneath the surface had begun to move without fully revealing itself. And I watched them both without reaction, because there are moments when the truth does not need to be spoken. It simply needs to be allowed to exist long enough for others to recognize it. And as the service was about to begin, a staff member approached Lydia with a quiet urgency, not disruptive, not dramatic, but noticeable enough to interrupt her rhythm. And she turned slightly, listening as the staff member spoke in a low voice. And for the first time, her expression shifted beyond control, not into panic, but into something less certain, something that suggested the structure she believed she managed had just introduced a detail she did not expect. And she responded quickly, her tone still firm. But there was a subtle edge to it now, something that had not been there before. And the staff member nodded, stepping back, but not entirely at ease. And I saw Lydia glance briefly across the room, her eyes scanning as if searching for confirmation of something she could not immediately locate. And then her gaze passed over me, just for a moment, and I met it without hesitation, not offering explanation, not offering reassurance, simply present. And she looked away just as quickly, returning her focus to the front. But the rhythm had shifted, and I recognized it immediately, because control, once interrupted, never fully returns in the same way. And I remained still, my posture unchanged, my expression steady, because nothing in this moment required my intervention. And the service began shortly after, voices lowered, attention directed forward, the room settling into the formality it had been arranged to present. But beneath it all, the earlier interruption lingered, subtle but undeniable, and Lydia's movements, though still composed, carried a slight hesitation now, a fraction of a pause where certainty had been uninterrupted before. And I allowed it to remain exactly as it was, because what had been introduced into her understanding was not something she could remove, only something she would eventually have to face. And as I sat there, listening without truly focusing on the words being spoken, I understood that everything was aligning precisely as it had been intended long before today. Not in a way that required confrontation, not in a way that demanded explanation, but in a way that would reveal itself naturally. And I folded my hands calmly in my lap, my gaze steady, because there are moments when silence is not just restraint, it is the final step before truth becomes impossible to ignore. And I knew that moment was already beginning. The service continued with the quiet formality everyone expected, words spoken in measured tones, memories shared in a way that felt structured rather than personal. And I remained still, my hands folded lightly in my lap, listening without truly engaging, because my attention had already shifted to something far more revealing than anything being said at the front of the room. And as the minutes passed, I could see Lydia's control beginning to strain in subtle ways, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to recognize immediately, because control, when challenged even slightly, never holds the same shape again. And she adjusted her posture more often, her gaze moving more than before, as if she was quietly searching for something that had slipped just beyond her grasp. And I understood that the brief interruption earlier had not resolved itself the way she expected, that whatever had been introduced into her understanding was still present, still unsettled, and I allowed that realization to continue without interference. Because there are moments when the absence of action is what allows truth to surface fully. And when the service reached its final moments, the room shifted again, people beginning to rise slowly, conversations returning in low voices, the structure dissolving into movement, and Lydia stepped forward once more, attempting to guide the transition, her tone steady, her gestures controlled. But there was a difference now, a slight hesitation that had not been there before. And as she spoke with a member of the staff again, I noticed the same quiet tension in their exchange, the same careful choice of words, the same underlying uncertainty that had begun to surface. And this time, it did not pass unnoticed by Daniel, who watched more closely, his expression tightening just enough to suggest that he too was beginning to recognize that something was not aligning the way it should, and I stood slowly, not drawing attention, not disrupting the moment, simply moving with the same calm presence I had carried from the beginning, and I stepped toward the edge of the room, positioning myself where I could observe both of them clearly. And Lydia glanced in my direction again, her eyes pausing for a fraction longer this time, as if she was trying to reconcile something she did not yet understand. And I met her gaze without hesitation, my expression unchanged, because clarity does not require explanation, it only requires time. And she looked away once more, returning her focus to the staff member in front of her. But the rhythm had shifted again, and this time it was more visible. The certainty she had carried earlier now replaced by something less defined, something that could not be controlled simply by speaking with confidence. And I remained still, my posture steady, because everything that needed to happen was already unfolding without my involvement. And as the room continued to fill with quiet movement and subdued conversation, I understood that the structure Lydia believed she had built was no longer holding in the way she expected, that something beneath it had begun to assert itself, something she had not accounted for, and I allowed that realization to settle naturally, because what is real does not need to be introduced. It reveals itself when assumption begins to fail, and I stood there, watching without reaction, knowing that the moment she was trying to avoid was already approaching, and that when it arrived, it would not require my voice to be understood. The conversations around the room continued to rise and fall in quiet waves, the kind of polite exchanges that fill space without revealing anything of substance. And I remained where I was, still, attentive, because what mattered now was no longer what people were saying, but how they were beginning to respond to something they did not yet understand. And I watched as Lydia stepped aside with the same staff member once more, her posture tighter now, her tone lower, more controlled than before, as if she was trying to manage a situation that no longer responded to her direction in the way she expected. And I could see the shift clearly, the difference between leading and correcting. And she was no longer leading, she was adjusting. And that distinction, though subtle, changes everything. And Daniel noticed it too, his attention fixed more directly now, no longer drifting, his expression no longer neutral, as if he was beginning to question the foundation of what he had accepted earlier without hesitation. And I allowed that awareness to build without interference, because realization is far more powerful when it arrives on its own. And as Lydia spoke, I saw the staff member respond with careful precision, not defiant, not uncertain, but measured in a way that suggested their role was no longer aligned with her assumptions. And that was when she paused, just for a moment, a fraction of hesitation that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not by me. And in that pause, everything she believed she controlled began to separate from her grasp, not dramatically, not visibly, but undeniably. And I stepped forward then, not into the center, not into confrontation, but closer, enough to be seen without forcing the moment. And Lydia's gaze met mine again, this time holding just slightly longer, as if she was searching for something in my expression that might explain what she was beginning to sense. And I gave her nothing beyond calm clarity, because explanation offered too soon only delays understanding. And she turned back to the staff member, her voice firmer now, her words more direct. But the response she received did not change. It remained consistent, composed, grounded in something that did not shift with her tone. And I could see it settling in, not fully, not completely, but enough to disrupt the certainty she had built. And around us, the room continued as if nothing had changed, guests moving, voices blending, the illusion of normalcy holding just enough to mask the shift taking place beneath it. And I remained still, my posture steady, because there are moments when the most powerful position is not in action, but in presence. And this was one of those moments. And Daniel stepped slightly closer now, his attention drawn not by what was being said, but by what was no longer aligning. And I saw the question forming in his expression, the quiet recognition that something fundamental had been overlooked, and I allowed that realization to continue without interruption, because what they were beginning to see could not be undone once fully understood. And as Lydia finally stepped back from the staff member, her composure intact but no longer effortless, I knew that the moment she had been avoiding was no longer approaching. It had already arrived. She just had not fully accepted it yet. And I stood there, calm, unmoved, knowing that everything she believed she had secured was no longer responding to her, and that truth, once it settles, does not ask for permission to be seen. The shift in the room had become undeniable, even if no one was willing to name it yet, and I could see it in the way conversations faltered slightly before continuing, in the way staff moved with a quiet awareness that did not align with Lydia's earlier authority, and most clearly in Lydia herself, who now stood just off-center, her posture still composed but no longer effortless, her movements more deliberate, as if each step required confirmation instead of assumption. And I remained where I was, watching without reaction, because what was unfolding no longer required my participation. It only required my presence. And as she spoke again to the same staff member, her tone firmer this time, there was a subtle tension in the exchange that had not been there before. A quiet resistance that was not disrespectful, but absolute, grounded in something that did not change based on her voice or her position in the room. And I saw the moment it registered, not fully, not completely, but enough to interrupt her certainty. And she paused, just briefly, her eyes shifting again, scanning the space as if searching for alignment that no longer existed. And when her gaze found me once more, there was something different in it now. Not control, not confidence, but recognition beginning to form without understanding. And I met her eyes calmly, offering nothing beyond the steady clarity I had carried from the beginning, because answers given too early are rarely understood. And she looked away again, but this time not with dismissal, with calculation. And Daniel stepped closer, his attention now fixed entirely on the exchange, no longer passive, no longer distant, as if he too could feel that something foundational had shifted beneath everything they believed was settled. And I watched him carefully, because awareness, once it begins, does not retreat. It only expands. And the staff member spoke again, quietly, precisely, their words measured but final, and Lydia listened without interruption this time, her posture still, her expression controlled, but the space around her no longer responded the way it had before, and I could see it clearly, the separation between what she believed she directed and what actually moved, and that separation does not close once it has been revealed. And I stepped forward slightly, not enough to disrupt, not enough to draw attention, but enough to exist fully within the moment. And the distance between us became something more than physical. It became understanding, one built on assumption, the other on certainty. And I held my position, my hands relaxed at my sides, my expression unchanged, because there was nothing left to prove, only something left to be seen. And as Lydia finally stepped back, her composure intact but her certainty fractured, I knew that the moment had fully arrived, not in a dramatic collapse, not in a confrontation, but in a quiet realization that could not be undone. And around us the room continued to move, guests unaware, conversations resuming, the surface holding steady while everything beneath it had already shifted, and I remained still within it, because what had been set in motion long before this day did not require announcement. It only required time, and that time had already come. The moment settled into place without announcement, without disruption, without anything that resembled the kind of confrontation Lydia had prepared herself to handle. And that was exactly why it could not be controlled, because what she was facing was not resistance, it was reality. And reality does not respond to tone or posture or assumption, it simply exists. And I stepped forward fully then, not into her space, not into dominance, but into clarity. And the staff member turned slightly toward me with a quiet acknowledgement that required no introduction, no explanation, just recognition. And in that small, precise movement, everything that had been unspoken became visible. And Lydia saw it, not in words, not in statements, but in alignment, the kind that cannot be performed, the kind that cannot be borrowed. And for the first time since we had arrived, she did not speak immediately. She did not redirect. She did not adjust. She paused, and that pause carried more truth than anything she had said all day. And Daniel stepped closer, his attention no longer divided, his expression no longer uncertain, but searching, as if he was finally looking for something real instead of something convenient. And I met his gaze briefly, not to explain, not to reassure, but to allow him to see what had always been there. And then I looked back at Lydia, who now stood in a space that no longer responded to her in the way she expected, her posture still composed, but no longer supported by assumption. And I spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, but clearly, because clarity does not need volume. And I told her that there was no need to rearrange anything further, that everything had already been arranged long before today. And the staff member beside her nodded once, not in agreement with me, but in confirmation of what had already been established. And Lydia's expression shifted again, not into anger, not into denial, but into recognition that could no longer be avoided. And I watched as the understanding settled in stages, first confusion, then calculation, and finally acceptance, not of defeat, but of limitation. And I remained calm, my posture unchanged, because nothing in this moment required anything more than presence. And Daniel looked between us, his gaze moving from Lydia to me and back again. And I could see the realization forming, the quiet acknowledgement that what he had believed to be structured and certain was neither, and that what he had overlooked was not small, not insignificant, but fundamental. And I allowed that realization to complete itself without interruption, because truth, once seen, does not need to be argued. And around us, the room continued to move in quiet normalcy, guests unaware, conversations resuming, the surface unchanged while everything beneath it had already shifted. And Lydia stepped back slightly, not retreating but recalibrating, her silence now carrying weight instead of control. And I held her gaze for just a moment longer before turning slightly away, not dismissing her, not diminishing her, but acknowledging that the moment no longer required my attention. And as I did, I understood fully that nothing had been taken from me, nothing had been given to me. Everything had simply been revealed, and the smallest room they had offered me no longer held any meaning at all, because the space that mattered had never been assigned by them. It had always belonged to me.